Thank you for that introduction, and also thank you for inviting me. It's extremely nice to have the chance to return to some of the materials that I was thinking about in my book and to reconsider them in light of the theme of your seminar on reforms. So I'm okay. Historians of the university have emphasized continuity rather than rupture in their studies and explanations of historical change. I'm thinking of the bibliography that I sent to the seminar at the beginning. Grendler, Black, um, Lisa Jardine, and Anthony Grafton, and so forth. But one area of disagreement among these scholars concerns the impact of humanism, which is, as we all know, the return to and critical evaluation of ancient texts. Assessing the field, Robert Black has noted that while Paul Grendler saw the impact of humanism on the university as positive and connected to various kinds of innovation, Anthony Grafton and Lisa Jardine saw humanism as really bringing about the decline of scholasticism, which they thought, quote, trained men to think and argue for themselves, end quote. For Grafton and Jardine, the philological methods of humanism trained students to be docile bureaucrats. Jardine, moreover, developed the critique even further. The claims to moral education that humanists made were unavailable to learned humanist women, a point that Lisa Jardine uses to highlight not only the social constraints placed on women in the period, but also, and in this case more importantly, the hypocrisy of humanism's claim to prepare students for the active life and endow them with virtue. So my paper today explores the model of continuity by showing how a set of reforms in the 15th century in Padua laid the foundation for the 16th century. And it does this in order to reconsider the impact of humanism in medicine, where it was tied not only to new texts in the curriculum, but also to new spaces for the study of medicine, such as the botanical garden and the anatomical theater. As Black notes, following a model of continuity, he says, quote, we must work harder to identify innovation through or beyond reforms, end quote. So with that in mind, I trace some of the impact of medical humanism through the construction of the botanical garden and two anatomical theaters in Padua. Both constructions, all three constructions had the support of Venice, and this was at least partly due to the idea that they would bolster the reputation of the university and help to attract foreign students. While the botanical garden bears a close or more direct connection to humanist translations of Materia Medica, the anatomical theater is a more complicated case. I will develop that complication through two episodes involving the anatomical theater that highlight some of the hypocrisy that Lisa Jardine identified in the program of humanist education. My paper will conclude by suggesting that an understanding of the reforms to the university and the special attention given to medical botany and anatomy allow us to see how innovation emerges in the history of medicine. Vesalius is often cited as a heroic or at least innovative teacher of pedagogy, an innovative teacher of anatomy, but the reforms to the medical curriculum indicate that the importance of institutional settings, curriculum, and resources was often emphasized. Secondly, this paper considers how this picture of the university might further contextualize the debates between the Jesuits and the university in Padua in the late 16th century. Okay, so let's turn to Padua. One of the most important moments in the history of the University of Padua was its re-emergence after Venice was defeated in the Battle of Agnadello in 1509 during the War of the League of Cambrai. The defeat happened in May, and it encouraged citizens in Padua to quickly reject Venetian rule. But their freedom ended when Venetian troops soon after recaptured the city in mid-July. During this time, some professors left the university and many students stayed away. And for the next several years, the university was in disarray. It began to function and rebuild itself only in 1517 and the years following. This is when the Senate documents begin to refer to the three reformatori, or liaisons, between the university and the Venetian Senate, known eventually as the Reformatori dello Studio di Padova. In the years to come, the reformatory made recommendations about things like faculty appointments and salaries. They also address issues at the university, sometimes reprimanding professors or students, and at other times seeking additional funding from the Senate for special events or for additional constructions. As the university entered this phase of rebuilding, it strengthened several of the features of the reforms that had been enacted in the mid-15th century. So now I'm going to go back. In the mid-15th century, in the 1450s, the university suffered a drop in enrollment that made the institution financially unstable. The cost of the university was paid traditionally by tuition and by revenue from Padua. The revenue came from two taxes, one called a vehicle or head tax, and the other a tax on notarial documents. In 1457, though, the university reported a drop from 800 students to 300 students. Assessing the enrollment problem, Venetian authorities worried about absenteeism among professors, about aging professors who failed to attract students, and about external pressures related to the fall of Constantinople in 1453. So in 1463, the Senate then issued the following set of reforms, which I've described here briefly on the slide. These are recorded in Grenler's history as well. There were fines that would be given to professors who were absent from Padua. Venetian subjects were compelled to study in Padua, otherwise they would have trouble getting a job after they graduated. Two local schools in Venice that were associated with competition were prohibited from granting degrees. The roles for teaching, or the courses that were going to be offered, had to be prepared in May so that they could be publicized for the following year. And the number of professors was expanded. So in addition to the first ordinary professor and the concurrent professor, a third professor would be added who would lecture. And these were reserved often for recent graduates, so we can think of them as kind of postdoctoral fellows. In 1479, the Senate also ruled that Paduans could not be concurrents, meaning that the first and second positions, which taught at the same time, could not be local Paduans. The Senate also forbid Venetian patricians and cittadini from holding professorships. And to ensure that these limitations on localism prevailed, the Senate did away with student votes of approval, so the student evaluations would have no impact on appointments. In the subsequent decades, the professoriate began to expand and enrollment increased, just as they had hoped. According to Grenler and other sources, the fragmentary evidence on enrollment suggests that the university regained its students, creeping upwards to 900 or 1,000 students by 1479. Aligned with these structural reforms was the development of academic space and its allocation. The university acquired Bo, or the Palazzo del Bo, in 1493, and Venice subsidized its renovations into a teaching facility. This is the picture that you see. So the reforms of the 15th century, I want to consider that they prioritized the role of faculty and its international constitution, no longer drawing on local talent. The reforms set out to publicize the teaching of these renowned faculty, and in doing so to attract students, especially foreign students. In addition, the setting of the university became a priority. So, not only did the campus of the university expand, but Venice funded that expansion. Subsequent reforms, the ones that I'll talk about in the 16th century, in both their scope and direction, reflected the reforms of this initial phase of development. I'm stuck. Okay. Medical humanism in the 16th century. So in the 16th century, in the arts faculty where the medical curriculum resided, the medical curriculum was organized, of course, around the ideas of Galen as well as Aristotle and Avicenna. And its core texts were drawn from Avicenna's canon and individual texts and commentaries on Galenic medicine. The medical faculty consisted of professors in medical theory, medical practice, and surgery. Although the curriculum stayed mostly the same, the selection of texts throughout the 4 years of study for a medical student shifted. And this was because scholars had begun early in the century to investigate the texts associated with medical study. This broad investigation has come to be known as medical humanism. Medical humanism is usually said to begin with Niccolo Leonceno, who studied Greek and eventually taught in Padua and later Ferrara. He collected Greek texts and corresponded with well-known humanists outside of medicine, such as Pico della Mirandola and Poliziano. He also collaborated with Aldo Manuzio, the printer, in the editing and publication of Greek texts, including Galen's Methodus Medendi, which he put out in 1500. He also was associated with parts of what became the 5-volume Greek Editio Princeps of Galen's works, published in 1525. The work of medical humanists continued in these decades of the 16th century. The Giunti Press in Venice published Galen's works, most of them at least, in Latin in 1541. And this is a picture of Galen's vivisection of a pig in the bottom of this slide. Medical academics such as Agostino Gadaldino, Giovanni Battista da Monte, and Andreas Vesalius edited or translated many titles in this 10-part edition. This project of translation, and there were others like it, brought scholars in Padua together with learned men and printers in Venice, and they shared not only linguistic skills, but also philological strategies for textual analysis and a commitment to resuscitating and evaluating ancient ideas. In Padua, these commitments in turn brought new attention to the study of both medical botany and anatomy. Medical humanism brought new attention to pharmacological medicine, or materia medica. The important text in this case was Dioscorides De Materia Medica, and although the work had been known to earlier scholars, the Aldine Press issued the first Greek edition in 1499, which was followed by Latin editions thereafter. By 1600, editions of it existed in most European vernaculars alongside commentaries. Dioscorides' work, along with Galen's work on simples, were also taught in courses on medical botany at the university from 1532, when a chair in medical botany was first established. So here there's a connection, a kind of direct connection between the publication of these texts medical humanists were working on, and then the construction of a chair in medical botany. Hearing of requests by students for this chair, the Venetian Senate eventually appointed Francesco Bonafede, a professor of practical medicine, and he held the position until 1549, when Gabriele Fallopio took it over, holding it at the same time that he was a professor of anatomy and surgery. For students, the courses on materia medica were also eventually aligned with the botanical garden. The garden was established in 1545 as a result of student advocacy. Students petitioned to have it constructed on the grounds that it would enable them to learn more about the subject and to learn more quickly. They also suggested that the garden would help to maintain Padua's reputation as an exceptional institution, rival perhaps only to Bologna, and therefore be useful in recruiting more students. Their petition listed famous ancient authors, Dioscorides, Galen, Pliny the Elder, as well as modern authors, Italian ones, but also northern ones. Leonhard Fuchs and Otto Brunfels were mentioned, right, indicating that the construction of medical botany involved an international network. The Republic of Venice authorized and financed the construction of the garden, but the maintenance of the garden also relied on the city of Padua's support. As Grenler notes in 1552, the Riformatore dello Studio ordered that animal manure, should be collected on the streets of Padua and used in the garden as fertilizer. When the garden was established, the Venetian government aligned it with other gardens in Crete and Cyprus, which were connected to the Venetian Republic, and they also cast it in light of commercial relations with the whole of the Eastern Mediterranean. The decree establishing it reiterated the practical aim of this renewed interest in botany, namely that existing errors in pharmacy would be diminished and lives would be saved through the revival of classical materia medica. The garden thus connected students to the world of pharmacy in Venice, a world filled by educated and vernacular healers, including women, and a world increasingly regulated. That the Republic funded the construction of the garden highlights an aspect of continuity with other reforms, which sought, on the one hand, to attract foreign students and maintain the happiness of the current ones, but also that Venice aligned the garden with the commercial activity in pharmacy suggests an innovative approach designed to encourage a more practical orientation through this, what we might call a medically oriented space at the university. Medical humanism, of course, also impacted anatomy, a point that is well developed in the historiography on anatomy and human dissection. We can take Vesalius as a central figure here. In 1537, Vesalius came to Padua to study medicine, and in the same year he was awarded his doctorate in medicine. There's no official record of his appointment, but he seems quickly to have been made demonstrator in anatomy and lecturer in surgery, roles that he held until 1542 when he went to Basel to oversee the production of his monumental work, the De Humani Corporis Fabrica, and the shorter atlas called the Epitome. In these years, Vesalius was editing texts and working on his own texts, and I think it makes sense for us to see him as fully immersed in the culture of medical humanism that existed in Padua and Venice. At the university, however, there were aspects of the medical curriculum that constrained the study of anatomy as Vesalius thought that it should proceed. In the Fabrica, Vesalius explains that private lessons in anatomy among a few students are definitely preferable to public demonstrations. So these are the two venues that we can think through. He also says that even in public demonstrations, he strives to let students carry out dissections as much as possible, quote, so that even those with little instruction, if called upon to dissect a cadaver before a throng of spectators, can conduct the anatomy correctly with their own hands, end quote. Vesalius elsewhere encouraged students, quote, to feel with their own hands and trust them, end quote. So this is what we might think of as an innovation in pedagogy in the way that anatomy was taught, and it's certainly among the many significant ideas that Vesalius promoted. Here, however, I think we have to ask what happened in the wake of Vesalius's departure from Padua. Did curricular changes or reforms take place in anatomy that implemented Vesalius's innovative approach? Did anatomy lessons change significantly to promote touch, right, feeling with your own hands, as well as sight? Did the university recognize the appeal of private lessons and alter the instruction on anatomy? The answers seem for a long time to be no. No, they didn't. Indeed, the structure of anatomy lessons changed very little. So traditionally, the anatomy demonstration was organized around a chaired professor called the lector, who read from the text while the ostensor showed the dissector where to dissect. And the dissector, a surgeon or a barber surgeon, and sometimes an advanced student, would dissect the part of the body in question. The image that you see here is taken from an edition of Mondino da Liuzzi's anatomy text published by Johann de Keitham, and you can see the anatomist as the chaired professor standing behind his lectern, and then, and then the ostensor is this guy in red, and he's holding his pointer to the part of the body that the dissector is then supposed to dissect. In 1554, although Gabriele Fallopio was the chaired professor, it was Victor Trincavella who was supposed to provide the ordinary lecture for practical medicine, who was scheduled to read as lector. And Fallopio, in this case, was scheduled to do the cutting and showing in the anatomy demonstration. But then, when the demonstration took place on January 25th, another professor, Appellato, read the text of Mondino, so this text that you see illustrated here, while Trincavella explained it, probably in the position of ostensor, and showed Fallopio where to dissect. So the Transalpine student describing this event also noted, quote, "The first reading was quiet, the second early on interrupted. So coming to the reading in the theater and with great difficulty, he," meaning Appellato, was heard for the first time, and then coming to the showing, the students were so dissatisfied that they did not remain. The second reading was totally interrupted, nor could anyone speak a word because of the noise the students were shouting, the noise of the students who were shouting, quote, "We want Falloppio, we want Falloppio," end quote. The student's description tells us that the teaching of anatomy was organized in this case as it had been for decades. The lector would read, the ostensor would show, and the dissector would cut. The unusual parts of this event were that Trincavella showed Falloppio where to cut, and that Falloppio decided to cut instead of behave like a chaired professor reading from the lectern. The tripartite structure, nevertheless, was preserved. Falloppio seems to have enjoyed a consistently good relationship with the Transalpine students. From some of his letters, we learn that foreign students sought out anatomy lessons and also that they threatened to leave the university if anatomy demonstrations did not take place. The next year, following this demonstration, in 1556, when winter had arrived in Padua and the break between semesters was approaching, the students were eager for anatomy. Falloppio wrote to the Riformatori dello Studio about their eagerness. He speculated that if preparations for the annual anatomy demonstration were not soon underway, these students would leave the university for either Bologna or Ferrara, where such spectacles, feste, were regularly held. Falloppio then asked the Reformatori to intervene by writing a letter to the Podesta, the civic authority in Padua, in order to expedite the acquisition of cadavers. The body of a criminal, who was also foreign, should be passed covertly, segretamente, to the student assistants. So a letter like this contains many insights into the realities of anatomical study in the mid-16th century after Vesalius's departure from Padua. Especially important is the fact that the study of anatomy was motivated not only by professors like Falloppio, but also by students. It was their eagerness and threats to abandon the institution that led to Falloppio's advocacy on the one hand and the support from Venice on the other. So here then we meet this perennial concern for enrollment that in turn motivated Falloppio, the professor, motivated the Reformatori, liaisons to Venice, and eventually motivated the Podesta, the civic administration in Padua. The medical humanism of Vesalius and others certainly brought attention to anatomy, especially to Galen's two main anatomical texts, but significant curricular change in the study of anatomy took much longer to emerge. A permanent anatomical theater was built in 1584, and not much is known about it except that it was often dangerously overcrowded. It was destroyed in 1589, the year in which it was described as overcrowded, and also the year in which a fight broke out between Sicilian students who then threatened the other spectators in the theater. The Transalpine student recording the event called the Sicilian students assassins. A second larger theater was built in 1594 and completed in 1595. These are the images that you see here of the second theater. Early records suggest that it was less crowded and more tranquil than its precursor. It held anatomy demonstrations that were formal or more ritualized, and as I have argued elsewhere, they were more natural philosophical in their approach to anatomy and human dissection. So the connections between humanism and the anatomical theater seem to me to be less straightforward than those between humanism and medical botany. So here are two additional episodes that I think encourage us to reflect on humanism as it presents itself in this theater. In 1589, the anatomist Girolamo Fabrici, who taught William Harvey, gave an anatomy demonstration that began with a discussion of the muscles related to speech and the organs serving pronunciation. Digressing from the main topic of his demonstration, he paused to connect the subject to his audience of students. A Transalpine student recorded this description in the official records of his nation. He wrote, Fabrici began on this occasion of his sermon to ridicule the pronunciation of various student nations. In the midst, he arrived at our praiseworthy nation, saying, quote, the pronunciation of the Transalpines is hard and slow, since indeed they wish to pronounce words while they compress the mouth excessively. This would be the cause, so that always they pronounce awkwardly the f for the v. And for the record, he began to demonstrate the words through that phrase. So, imitating the speech of the Transalpines, Fabrici meant, he who drinks wine lives a long time. But the students found his joke that they slurred their speech and spoke like, quote unquote, drunkards, humiliating. By their account, he put forth these words as they wrote, quote, ad nauseum. He felt great joy from these words, so much repeated that he was unable to contain his own laughter, end quote. Although Fabrici brought himself and the scene to order, the Transalpine students said that they felt exposed in the presence of all the other nations. So with the joke, Fabrici called attention to the Transalpine students really as foreigners, flagging their status as linguistic and demographic outsiders. So let's remember this was not a grammar lesson, this was an anatomy lesson. But the scene captures the less obvious, more coercive functions of the anatomical theater, its ability to configure and recognize the social relations of the students and their professor, and its ability to connect anatomical themes quite directly to issues of both classical education, Latinity, how they spoke Latin, and civility, their manner of speaking, right? So these two kind of hallmarks of humanism. Medical humanism was, as we know, deeply tied to text, to translations, editorial emendations, critical commentaries, illustrations, but it also depended on vocal exchange. Oral, not just written culture, was shaped by humanism, as Fabrici's attack on the speech of Transalpine students indicates. What's more is that the agenda activates a crucial set of oppositions. Right? If we step back from it, there are the Italian students and the Transalpine students. There are Southern Europeans and Northern Europeans, and the Latinity that goes with them. There's civility and incivility. There's speech and silence, and perhaps even reason and drunkenness. These oppositions seem to evoke humanism, but also some of the hypocrisy internal to humanism. Jardine illuminates some of these in the context of humanist women in the period, but here our foreign students would seem to suffer in similar ways. This point can be expanded or maybe made more complicated as we move from the first permanent anatomical theater to the second one. In 1595, the second anatomical theater held a demonstration that appealed to a wide public. There were scholars and students, as well as local members of the community, including tailors, shoemakers, sausage makers, and other craftsmen. Perhaps considering his own fame in this moment, Fabrici had called for a quote-unquote free anatomy. And following this episode, he wrote to the Venetian Senate to request additional money that would offset the cost of the event. We should say, too, that the cost for the event, that usually money was taken up, a kind of entrance fee, and this was to pay in part for the burial of the cadaver's remains at the end. In response to this idea of a free anatomy that Fabrici had raised, two students, a Dane and a Silesian, wrote passionately against it. And this is the sort of high rhetoric that they brought to bear on the situation. I counsel that there should be no credence given to the opinion of those who try to introduce anatomy for free in this academic institution, a sort of disease of the humanities, this notion of free education or of free anatomy, and the most open window of sedition and murder, contrary to our ancient traditions that have been preserved all the way to the present age. Indeed, what would agitate more vehemently or excite to arms more quickly those nobles and learned members of the famous school, those enjoying the extraordinary and unassailable privileges? What could be worse than to witness with a hostile eye or to allow a crowd of the worst sort of gaping craftsmen and vulgar men to occupy the lower benches, nay, the whole theater, to trample, diminish, and impede the sweetest fruit of anatomy, end quote. So here the students call the free anatomy a disease of the humanities, which I am curious about how to take. I mean, in the 1590s, the Jesuits were busy offering free instruction at the undergraduate level only, but it was in connection to the humanities. And so I wonder if part of the context for this, part of what we're supposed to hear, is that debate. In addition, though, the idea of a free anatomy has encouraged these students to identify their education as our ancient traditions and as an education in need of protection. That protection is imagined as a call to arms, a metaphor directed at the protection of the extraordinary and unassailable privilege of these noblemen. And the passage concludes with a dramatic contamination of the theater. These students, we have to remember, these students are writing they're not witnessing the event, they are imagining what it would be like if craftsmen came inside the theater. In this sort of active imagination, the craftsmen are seen to occupy the lower benches close to the dissected cadaver, a place usually reserved for dignitaries and other professors. Also, these craftsmen are described as gaping, rather than, we could imagine, looking in the right way, and their presence is seen to trample, diminish, and impede those sweet fruits of anatomy. These students viewed the potential presence of craftsmen or commoners inside the anatomical theater as utterly contaminating in an anthropological sense. In the context of the 1590s, their defense of their education emphasizes the humanist aspects of their education. It also echoes some of the concerns that were raised in the polemical debate between the Jesuits and the university, especially those voiced by Cesare Cremonini. Most important is the idea of a free education, and maybe secondly, the approach to university space as something that needs to be protected. Space, so central to the reforms that the university had made and to the ways that Venice invested in the university, became, we might say, active in formulations of moral imperatives, educational agendas, and even student life at the university. These students were imagining the space of the theater and even where craftsmen would be situated within that theater. Right? Space and its protection seemed to matter a great deal in the 1590s. So I want to conclude briefly so that we have a chance to think more about these ideas. My paper today has pursued the model of continuity in the reforms of the University in Padua, showing linkages between the 15th century reforms that sought to stabilize the university and 16th century developments which maintained the emphasis on stability and shaped the way that medical humanism and the new attention to medical botany and anatomy impacted the medical curriculum and more broadly the reputation of the university. The enrollment of foreign students and the construction of space were the two, I think, most prominent aspects of reform in the period. Secondly, this picture of the university, and particularly the medical faculty and curriculum, helped to correct some of the heroic histories of medicine, often featuring Vesalius. We can see how institutional and curricular changes happened gradually, but how they required additional resources and investment, and how they have multiple consequences. The garden and anatomical theater were constructed to ensure the presence of foreign students, but the garden, more than the anatomical theater, related clearly to the humanist study of materia medica, or to medical humanism in the period. As the examples involving the anatomical theaters suggest, the relationship between humanism and the theater was less straightforward. I think too often humanism is associated directly with innovation, but my sources suggest that the idea of humanist education could be used to exclude foreigners, as when Fabrici made fun of how they spoke Latin, and they could be also used by foreigners to exclude commoners, but in addition to lay claim to their privilege and by extension, their education. So these episodes also reveal the special significance of the foreign students to the university. Their enrollment brought financial stability to the institution. This was known to Venice, and the Senate continued to support foreign students. The Senate ensured anatomy lessons would be held, as we saw with Fallopio's letter, but later the Senate also ensured that foreign students would be protected in the atmosphere of the Counter-Reformation. And there are sort of several ways to think about this. I think Alessandra will talk about this a bit. Finally, the history of reforms and the study of medicine in Padua suggests a number of convergences with the debate between the Jesuits and the university in the 1590s. That debate emphasized student enrollment, the allocation of space for lessons, and the concept of protection. Education needed protection, the institution needed protection, and then finally, academic freedom needed protection. These are all aspects that begin to be conceptualized in that debate. These could be seen in light of a much longer history of the institution at Padua, a history that includes its reforms and also the internal problems associated with the celebrated program of humanism in the period. Thank you.
Very well. Thank you very much, Professor Cynthia. I would like to congratulate you for your scrupulous respect for the time frame. It was perfect. And of course, you gave us an interesting conference, filled with information and branching in so many directions. For instance, you spoke about relations with powers, enrollment of students and teachers, professional activity of teachers and students, school texts, social promotions and careers, and so on, methods of dissection, spaces of study. So it was very, very rich. And now I would like to, Professor Celati from the University of Verona will join us. Her contribution to the debate will be, as mentioned before, a scientific commentary, and she has roughly 15 minutes to do so. Then we might cast the debate on the rest of the audience. Just before that, again, very briefly, I will introduce Professor Alessandra Celati. Here are my notes. She got her PhD from the University of Pisa. She has been a Marie Curie Global Fellow both at the University of Stanford and of Verona. Also, she has published several articles in first-class journals about the connection between medicine and heresy in the 16th century Italy, the history of religious dissent, and the history of medicine and its ancillary disciplines. She's also the author of a book entitled The World of Girolamo Toselini, a network on dissident physicians in 16th century Venice, forthcoming for Routledge in 2022, so this year. Her main research interests are religious history, history of medicine, the reconstruction of heretical networks in early modern Italy, and the digital humanities. So she's the person perfect to comment the subjects that you have exposed before. So please, Professor Alessandra Celati, the word is yours to be taken. Please, go ahead.
Thank you for this introduction, and thank you again for inviting me. And of course, thank you, Cynthia, for this very stimulating and rich and interesting talk. So I think this lesson has brilliantly showed how heroic histories of medicine, for instance, featuring Vesalius and other protagonists of humanistic medicine, are insufficient. An approach which looks at the history of medicine and medical faculties, which would be flattened on the concept of rupture between the scholastic and the humanistic age, would be misleading. Changes did happen, but they happened slowly. In this process, it was not only the action of important innovators such as Vesalius, which produced changes in the curriculum, but a virtuous circularity between students' demands for a more hands-on approach to the study of medicine and anatomy, and in particular demands promoted by foreign students, and institutional needs, namely the importance of keeping high the amount of students enrolled at Padua, resulting in economic advantages for the Serenissima and its university. The talk has also made a crucial point about the elitist attitude of humanism, which has been defined as the hypocrisy of humanism. At the heart of the humanistic environment, with which I mean the Paduan anatomical theater, pretentious oppositions were made between Italian and Transalpine students, Southern and Northern Latinity, civility and incivility, speech and silence, and even reason and its drunken counterpart, to quote Cynthia's talk. So was the lesson of tolerance, dialogue, collaboration, cosmopolitism that is typical of a certain conception of humanism, at least just a fake? The question is not banal, and I believe that our debate will contribute to solve it. Finally, Cynthia has reflected upon the polemical debate between the Jesuits and the university in the late 1590s. When the former began to hold classes and decided to grant graduate or doctorate degrees, the University of Padua and its community became upset. Free education was a problematic issue, and university space was thought of as something that needed protection. So in order to widen the framework of our discussion, I think it can be useful to go back to the general themes of our conference: networks, identities, and reform. These all are very dense concepts, which I think emerge from Cynthia's lesson, and more broadly speaking, from an examination of the Paduan University context. The concept of network refers to groups of individuals exchanging items or knowledge and making a collective effort to circulate ideas and information through different forms of interaction. In this respect, it can beneficially be applied to the University of Padua, where the construction of networks was the result of shared spaces and forms of knowledge and could contribute to a successful professional career. Networks linked together students and professors. So the concept of network allows to shift from the abstract level of ideas to the very concrete dimension of the people who formulated and shared these ideas in their daily lives. The opportunity to work and study at the most advanced European university, Padua, allowed students and scholars to establish long-lasting connections, which, in the years to come, developed from one place to the other of the Medical Republic of Letters. And this leads to the second term of our conference, that of identity. European physicians and anatomists were an essential part of this network and perceived themselves as such, as, for instance, it is shown by their correspondence. The discussion that Cynthia made of the notion of hypocrisy of humanism weakens the monolithic idea of a community of Paduan graduates and men of culture, all united by the same cultural ideas, vocational practices, professional values, and ambitions. So how did identity develop in the university space? What was the role of humanism? How did the creation of networks impact this development? And what kind of networks were established in Padua? With respect to this last question, I come to the third concept of this conference, so the one of reform. When we think about the concept of reform in the 16th century, we can't detach the reformation of knowledge and university institutions from the coeval religious upheaval which subverted the whole Europe in the 16th century. In this vein, Cynthia's talk has highlighted the interplay between Counter-Reformation and university institutions, and the way in which Transalpine students were seen as foreigners, probably because they were associated with Protestantism. The latter is a crucial point, as they allow us to look at the nuances of history, avoiding any reductionist approach to the study of the early modern period. In this vein, it is interesting to consider the role of foreign students in the perspective of their relationship with Italian ones. In fact, sources show that university students networks crossed national and religious boundaries. Northern European students were the vehicle for the spread of Reformed ideas and books, and they propagated the Reformation in classrooms, in shared houses, in libraries, bookshops, and even in taverns. And we have to say that Italian students were pretty happy to be contaminated, as the inquisitors would put it, shifting the methods and instruments of humanism from medical knowledge to the religious realm. I think this aspect is relevant in putting the anecdote about Fabrici in the anatomical theater in context. Networks of students often resisted the hypocritical humanism of their teachers for the sake of a less elitist but more dangerous, with respect to the preservation of the status quo, form of humanism. Several contributions in recent historiography have shown that many Paduan physicians and anatomists, and also physicians in general, tended to question religious orthodoxy and elaborated personal theological constructs in the age of the Reformation. In this process, humanism played an essential role. With its return to Hippocrates and Galen, medical humanism had conservative premises, but eventually it transformed the approach to the body and to nature. So as I see it, continuity and rupture coexisted. In their desire to imitate the ancients, physicians rediscovered the value of experience and started to perceive medicine as a rational practice. This methodological and epistemological change eventually affected not only the work of Italian physicians, but also the purpose of their profession, their social role, and the way in which they were related to the different disciplines associated with medical practice. In Galenic and humanistic thinking, the philosopher-physician was thus responsible for providing all-around care to the individual and seeking truth in whatever form it took. In this way, humanist physicians began to discuss the individual destiny of the soul after death, along with moral questions, the reliability of the holy texts transmitted through the ecclesiastical tradition, and the truthfulness of the dogma and principles of faith. A case in point, an interesting case in point in such a combination of the renovation of medicine and the adherence to the Reformation is Agostino Gadaldino, a physician and a humanist that has also been quoted in the lesson. Gadaldino embraced heterodox ideas in the 1540s when he practiced in Venice, which back then was considered the gate of the Reformation in Italy. And the humanistic methods of his profession played a key role in his heterodox experience. And this is shown by his Inquisition trial, which took place in 1555. In fact, from his depositions, he emerges as a man of culture accustomed to apply critical and philological methodology to all kinds of knowledge. Precisely between 1541 and 1542, when he worked for the Giunta brothers to coordinate the work of a critical Latin edition of Galen's opera Omnia in Venice, an enterprise, as Cynthia has highlighted, in which Vesalius was involved too. So in that precise time, he was involved in heterodox groups in Venice. A network was established among scholars in Padua, learned men and printers in Venice, and they all worked together to produce new restored versions of ancient books. And as Cynthia has shown, they shared linguistic skills, philological strategies, and a commitment to resuscitating and evaluating ancient ideas. For some of them, like Gadaldino, but we may think also of the juntas whose Catholic orthodoxy had been put in question too. So for some of them, reasoning and questioning was a mental habitus, a mental frame, and they spontaneously applied it also to religious issues. As Gadaldino stated in his trial, as a humanist, a bibliophile, and a philologist, as well as a physician, he was naturally inclined to move criticism from medieval medical culture to the Catholic religious paradigm. His trial ended with recantation. However, he continued to contribute to the heterodox movement, although marginally and sporadically, and he did so in the Paduan academic environment. Again, I think that a networked relational approach can illuminate the actual functioning of university procedural dynamics at the intersection between Counter-Reformation and the Venetian concerns about enrollments. One such contribution was Gadaldino's endorsement of the irregular doctoral candidacy of a young medical student with Calvinist leanings called Manusso Maran. And Gadaldino did so out of professional and confessional solidarity. In fact, in 1564, the bull In Sacrosanta Beati Petri established that a doctorate could only be obtained if the candidate professed the Catholic faith. Northern European students were naturally hostile to this law, and the secular authorities, at least in Padua, often turned a blind eye if German scholars failed to swear the relevant oath. As Cynthia has shown, secular authorities had a clear interest in maintaining the high number of foreign students enrolled in Padua. And it is significant, I think, that in Manusso Maran's trial, the inquisitors scrutinized every detail of his university experience. This involved investigating the relationship that he had forged and reconstructing the dynamics that had allowed a young man seriously tainted by heretical dissent. And I can give you some more detail about this if you are interested, but really seriously tainted by heretical dissent to obtain a doctorate. And this is an occurrence that happened frequently in Padua. So to conclude, networks, identities, and reform can be seen as the vertices of a prism which reverberates the intellectual, institutional, and social functioning of the medical faculty of Padua University. Fluid as these concepts are, they encourage us to dismiss strong and univocal categories of interpretation when it comes to early modern intellectual history. Institutional reform, teaching reform, and religious reform interacted with one another, and this interplay favored the construction of networks and the consequent development of common identities within them. At the same time, such interplay could also provide the ground for more tense relationships based in conflicting identities, such as the one between Southern and Northern men, Catholics and Protestants, and so on. In this complex scenario, humanism could take hypocritical shapes, which were consistent with its elitist vocation, as much as it worked as a bridge between medicine and religion, also being instrumental in establishing intellectual exchanges and in making ideas circulate. Knowledge progressed through slow steps, backsteps, uncertainties, tortuous paths, and complex interplays. Of this complexity, the 16th century University of Padua is a case in point. And now I'm happy to open the discussion. Thank you.